welcome to another edition of Undercurrent Stories. I'm Bob Wells. How much do you know about what's actually going on in Ukraine? Obviously you get daily news bulletins from the mainstream media, and they give a view on major events, but have you ever asked yourself what everyday life is like for civilians? Why people volunteer to go to Ukraine, either on a humanitarian basis or as a soldier, and what are their own backgrounds? And how are these people received when they go to Ukraine? And the Ukrainian people themselves, how do they see the end of the war? Well, to help answer these questions and more, I'm joined by Matt Gallagher. Matt is a US Army veteran who volunteered and helped civilians at the start of the war in 2022 and then returned again in 2023 as a journalist. His experiences led him to publish his fourth novel, Daybreak, which takes place in present-day Ukraine and features a disillusioned American volunteering for the war and to reconnect with a woman from his past. I have to say I found the novel very powerful as it's set in the present with a war that's actually still going on. It certainly helped me understand it from a human level. You're listening to Undercurrent Stories. My name is Bob Wells, and the purpose of this show is to bring you stories that are not necessarily available in the mainstream media. I hope you enjoy the episode and that it helps further your own understanding. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Matt.
Pleased to be with you, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Before we start, I've just finished the book. It was a fantastic book. I really enjoyed the book. And I think we were talking about before we went on air that it really gave me a sense of what life is like for, the people in Ukraine, in a war zone. And I thought I'd just mention there's one review which I read. There's a lot of very, very positive reviews, Matt, and there's one in particular that I think will resonate with listeners. And here we go. So we're living through such a renaissance of veterans writing, and Matt Gallagher is one of the very best. Daybreak is set in the Russia-Ukraine war, exploring the motivations and fates of Americans who go to fight with Ukraine. It's an unsparing but emphatic character study, but it's so much more than that. Reading it brought to mind the masterful work of F. Scott Fitzgerald. How does that feel?
It was a good morning when I saw that one pop up on my laptop screen. Yeah. Immersing readers in the everyday experience of Ukraine was very important to me. It was a big goal. So having readers who are interested in the subject, concerned for the Ukrainian people, but most people aren't able to go over there the way I have as a volunteer or journalist. So when I get reviews like that say I've met that threshold, it's thrilling.
Yeah, that's great stuff. So just before we talk about the novel, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your life's journey, and how you got into writing, please, Matt?
Sure thing. So about 15 years ago now, I was a scout platoon leader with the U.S. Army in Iraq. It was the formative experience of my life. I was a young man in charge of 30 soldiers, living amongst Iraqi civilians, and found we were there kind of during the counterinsurgency phase of the war, and really found that most of the training that I'd gone through, thinking kind of battle on battle, was not really relevant to my experience living and working with Iraqis, 99% of whom just wanted to return to normalcy. And it really kind of shaped how I view the world. It shaped how I view armed conflict. When I got home from our deployment and decided to be a writer and try to make a go of that, it has lingered with me all these years. And then when I found myself in Ukraine at the beginning of 2022, I went over there with some Army friends, also fellow veterans, to help evacuate one's in-laws from Kyiv. And also we kind of ended up working with some civilians in the city of Lviv, just kind of real basic self-defense, people who had never held a weapon before, to be prepared if the Russian invasion came to their neighborhood, came to their homes. I found myself kind of returning to that experience way back in 2008 in Iraq and thinking about how this war that 99% of Ukrainians did not want, it's just a matter of bad geography more than anything. It was just kind of a very natural prism, I think, for me to be viewing this war through and seeing the civilians in Lviv, the small acts of everyday courage, not necessarily joining the military to go join the front, and then fight at the front, which is, of course, tremendously brave in its own right. But watching a society rally around each other in defense of self-determination, I don't know. It just kind of connecting these two very different wars, these two very different experiences, was kind of the genesis for what ended up becoming Daybreak, the story in Daybreak.
What was your sort of motivation for actually going to Ukraine?
It's a great question, Bob. It's one my wife asked me in the lead up to me going. And I think it was to help. It was a unique opportunity to help people in a very small but hopefully meaningful way, to take some of the military training and experience that I had and help people who, everyday people, teachers, bus drivers, welders, who might be in a position to pick up a weapon and defend their homes, defend their families, defend their neighborhoods. In the years since my return from Iraq, I'd kind of become a bit of an anti-war writer, argued for America's military withdrawals from those countries. But I'm not a pacifist either. I believe there is a time and a place to defend oneself, that we need soldiers, we need young people willing to defend a nation and defend a nation's interests. And here was one of those situations, right? Ukraine, like America, like Britain, is a flawed country, but it deserves its right to self-determination. It deserves its right to independence and to self-governance. And here was a sovereign democracy being invaded for unjust reasons. And through my friends' connections, family connections over there, I was in a unique position to help in a small way. And I just kind of had to do it. I don't think I would have been able to live with myself had I not gotten on that plane and helped in a very small but direct way.
What sort of reaction did you get as a volunteer from the Ukrainian people when you came out?
So when we got there pretty early, late February 2022. At least that trip as I made as a volunteer. They were very welcoming. I've again, having served in Iraq, I'm aware of what it's like to be in a foreign country as an American where you are not wanted. Those memories have stuck with me all these years. This was very different. And I traveled to Poland and Lithuania before, so I was kind of familiar with the general reception that Eastern Europeans give Americans, and it's welcoming. It's the geopolitics of it are of course very different than the Middle East, so there's a historical reason for this. Some Ukrainians asked why we were there, and when we explained what we were doing, we were volunteers there on our own dime, on our own volition, just trying to help out civilians on basic self-defense. That passed the sniff test. But we got there like any war. It's like a moths to a flame. We came in with kind of some shady lost souls. We came in with some war profiteers, no doubt about it. Most of the people from the West, America, Britain, Canada, Australia, etc. Most people that we met were either going over to join the International Legion as fighters, or they were going over as humanitarians. But you did have kind of just a strange collection of people arriving in those early days of the war. And as a result, Ukrainians very directly asked us who we were and why we were there. And, like I said, I think our answer passed muster for at least most of them.
So when you went over, that was obviously at the start, wasn't it? February 22. How long were you over there for, Matt, initially?
Initially, just 3.5 weeks. The three of us all had families. We just kind of did a, initial course for people just to kind of get set up and stabilized, and then it was, time to come home. Whereas, a lot of the people that we arrived with on that first bus, whether they were going to be legionnaires or humanitarians, they were there for the long haul, and that fascinated me. That they were going to stay indefinitely.
Yeah, I think at the time it shocked the world, didn't it? I mean, we've got an earlier podcast that came out. I did it in, about the March 22, and I interviewed a brewery in Ukraine who were actually making beer with I won't tell you what the name was, but it had Putin's head on it.
I think I've seen that beer. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might come up in the book actually.
It does. Yes. Yeah. Yes, it does.
But there's something about the Ukrainians. They're so stoic. They're so not defiant, but they're so absolutely. They're going to go to the victory on this one. That's the impression that I get. Did you find that with the people?
Yes, and I think that's something I try to convey to people who from the West who haven't been there, and we're kind of soft and spoiled, right? These words, freedom, independence, democracy, right? If that's all we've ever known, and that's all I've ever known here in the States, you can kind of take them for granted. They kind of just can feel very ethereal and kind of vague and notional. Well, Ukraine's only been independent since 1991. And especially for people in their 40s or 30s, this is something they've been kind of incrementally fighting for through various social protest movements and social revolutions. Maidan being the most famous one in 2013, but the Orange Revolution before that, Kuchma back in 2000. I mean, this has been something that's been ongoing. And yes, there's a resolve. There's a belief in these vague notional ideas that we take for granted that is very real. And it's it's inspiring, and going over there, as somebody from my background and experience, and seeing people ready and willing and to fight to the death for this, there is no chance of losing, right? They will fight to the Russia may advance or whatever, but Lviv, we were in Lviv and pretty far west of Ukraine. These people will fight to the last Ukrainian if they have to. So if they're willing to do that, if they're willing to die for these ideals, willing to die for their country, I don't understand how 2 years later parts of the West we're getting squishy about that. I don't know. Maybe it's because I've been there and I've talked to these people, but they mean it. These aren't just talking points for them.
Yeah, and then you went out as a journalist, didn't you? Was that on your second trip out?
Yes, I made 2 subsequent trips as a journalist, both for Esquire. The first one was in the summer of 2022, and most recently the first one was in October of 2022, and the second one was in the summer of 2023. So kind of spaced apart, and weaknesses and drawbacks certainly to kind of leaving and returning. One of the strengths, I think, is maybe seeing how the war is changing and evolving, not just on a tactical level, with different type of weapon systems and everything, but how it's impacting the society, how it's starting to wear people down in different ways, and how that resolve that I mentioned earlier continues to deepen, even as it gets tested more and more.
Yeah, I read your when I was doing some research, I read your article in Esquire, which I think you were interviewing a soldier, a guy who I think he was about 50. And he wouldn't let his son go in. His son was studying somewhere else in Europe. I don't know whether he'd come back, but he wanted to fight, and his father wouldn't let him. And that sort of personified the resolve of the people, I guess.
Yes, we were right outside of Bakhmut. I mean, this is about 50, but real former weightlifting coach. I certainly wouldn't want to cross him in a trench, He didn't know who John Adams was, the second American president, but he basically said the same thing that John Adams did. He said, I study and fight war so my son can focus on international politics, which is, a fascinating refrain for me as an American of something our second president said during the Revolutionary War. And that interview, but that part of it in particular has stuck with me as well.
What was it like? I mean, obviously you've been in the war zone a lot anyway previously, but what was it like actually going into the war zone where you could hear all the weapons?
A tremendous difference. It's fascinating how your body wakes up to it, right? Parts of the kind of on a real physical, visceral way, my body being alert in a way it had not been for many years, a decade plus, but still recognizing it. It was kind of this fascinating primal thing. But also very different. It was certainly just my experience in those trips as a journalist, but also any Western veteran I interviewed who's fought both, either in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, but is now over there fighting. The first thing they mention is the artillery, right? We had concerns in our desert wars, but the sky was not one of them. And the heavy artillery bombardment, which Russia has a serious advantage in right now, the cruise missiles, the drones, just a different type of fear. And I talked. One of the people I interviewed was somebody I served with in Iraq, and he broke down during the interview talking about he and his squad got pinned under some heavy artillery bombardment for hours, and the psychological effect of that is I don't think the West understands that this kind of combat has not occurred since the World Wars, and Ukraine is familiar with that. Ukrainian society is already kind of preparing for, they're essentially kind of building out their own veterans hospitals and stuff. But I don't know if that aspect of it has really, penetrated the media, Western media bubble for whatever reason.
No, I don't think you see you certainly don't see an awful lot from the front line on the British media in the news. You see the results of bombings in cities and stuff, and perhaps a little bit, but you don't actually see what I guess you saw.
It's true. I mean, the same thing's happening over here. The attention on the conflict is kind of drifted. There's other global hotspots going on in the world. Ukraine runs a real tight ship in terms of media access and public relations. They're very conscious of Western media because of how reliant they are on Western aid and Western supplies. But the psychological impact on the everyday soldier and everyday Ukrainian civilian, if they're still living out east, and many are, this is going to be a decades-long issue. And
I was going to ask you, actually. I was going to ask you obviously for your own opinion about it, but when you talk to the guys out there, are you sort of saying that they see it as quite a long-term thing and not a quick fix?
They do. I think even the ones, what's great about Ukraine, like any free society, is you're going to get different opinions. Of course, people will disagree on how they see this war playing out. But even the ones that see maybe a treaty being kind of thrust upon them by the international body, right? Maybe a little bit of land in exchange for quote unquote peace. They don't see it as being lasting peace, right? The bad blood, the land disputes, the cultural and historical disputes between Ukraine and Russia go back centuries, and one of the most honest Ukrainian soldiers I talked to, and who I consider a friend and kind of trust immensely, he sees something like that happening in the next year or two, but he then said, but both sides will continue to build up and just kind of prepare for the next phase of the war. That it would be kind of a pause rather than a true peace. That's a brutal reality, and this is he's a father of two young boys. So because he's a stoic Ukrainian. So then when I followed up and asked about how does this impact, you being a father, he didn't want to pursue that, but it's something that as a young father, as a father of two young boys myself, I couldn't help but think about myself.
Yeah. In terms of the seed of the idea for the book, was that something that or Daybreak, is it something that you sort of thought about as you were travelling around as a journalist, or was it something when you came back home you thought, I've got an idea here? Can you tell us how you arrived at the idea of the book, Matt?
Sure. So, that first trip to Ukraine, I went as a volunteer. I did not go to write. At the same time, I'm a writer now. It's how I interact with the world. It's how I process things. And then with those subsequent trips as a journalist, I became really aware that there were some real interesting stories or anecdotes I was hearing second or third hand, or I was being told off the record, stuff I just couldn't necessarily source that made for good ingredients of fiction. At this point, I've written a decent amount of both fiction and nonfiction. I'm comfortable with both. There's some kind of like sorting process that my brain is able to do, and those men and women that we first rode in on that initial bus ride in on February 2022 that stayed when we went home, I couldn't shake them because they were so fascinating in terms of like going to fight for a democracy that you've never even been to. You're going to go fight for an ideal. It's a brave, heroic thing. It really is. At the same time, many of these people were kind of flawed characters. It's not a normal thing to be able to take off and go do that, right? Leave whatever your quote unquote normal life is behind at the drop of a hat. These were kind of lost soul types in some ways. Many of them were veterans of the same war that I fought in, or similar war, and felt disillusioned because of that experience, and maybe felt like this was a chance at redemption. And so those seeds stuck with me and ended up making it a Daybreak.
Yeah, and that comes out in the book. These as you say, lost souls who sort of need a sense of purpose. Obviously, with no spoilers, and I know how it all ends and how it goes through. But are you able to give a brief sort of rundown of what the book is for listeners, please, Matt?
Sure. It follows two American military veterans of Afghanistan into Ukraine in February 2022. One, Han Lee, he's a fighter. He's exactly who Zelensky calls for. Somebody who's willing to shoot Russian invaders in the face, and he's pretty good at it. He hasn't been good at regular normal life. He's been a supervisor at a Southern California Best Buy, and he hates it. So he's going to go back to the one thing he thinks he's good at in this world, and that's soldiering. The other is our main character, Luke Paxton, who's kind of going for more muddled reasons. He wants to help in some kind of vague way. He kind of suffers from severe post-traumatic stress due to a combat incident in Afghanistan, and like a lot of people with PTSD, not just combat related, but he's kind of been trapped and stuck everywhere there. That's kind of a common refrain for people suffering from PTSD, whether it's in Afghanistan or a car accident. And he's trying to track down a lost love, a Ukrainian woman named Svetlana Dovebush, who he lost track of 10 years before. And for whatever reason, he associates with where everything went wrong in his life. He meets up, I don't think it's a spoiler to say he meets up with her, but she's a very different person. 10 years is a long time, or can be. And she's, unlike Luke, she's moved on with her life. She's a mother now. But she, as a Ukrainian woman, this war is threatening to trap her and get her stuck the same way Afghanistan got Luke stuck. So, those are, I think, the three main characters, very different worldviews, very different perspectives on this war. But ultimately, this is a story, I think, of everyday people trying to make, who are flawed and have made mistakes, but are trying to do the best they can and trying to help out others in a big macro storm, a big macro force way beyond them. But they're still trying, and they're still trying to help. And those acts of everyday courage can make a difference sometimes if we take pause and observe them for what they are.
It's a great story, Matt, and the way that you've got some big themes there. You've got war, you've got everyday life, you've got the harrowing everyday life that people have. You've got the stoicism of the Ukrainians themselves and their humour, and then you've got love, and you've got all that, and you've got it happening in present day in a war zone that most people don't know an awful lot about. So I commend you for that, and I thoroughly recommend the book. It's a great book. Obviously I've seen quite a lot of the reviews. How's it being? What's the latest sort of feedback you're getting about the book?
It's been very well received. I wasn't quite sure what to, how it was going to, you're never quite sure how it's going to play out. Most of my previous works have been about wars that have already ended.
Yeah.
Right. So there's, especially on the fiction side, maybe there's more of an appetite to approach that. Especially with what's happened in Israel and Palestine and Gaza. There was concern maybe that, the world's attention had drifted from Ukraine. But I found that, got a great review. It's not a place I expected to review a novel, but a great review in foreign policy, which was, and it was a dream. The reviewer really connected with the book. She's a Ukrainian woman herself. So, having somebody from that background and that perspective with kind of more from the national security realm, taking time for a dark love story, it meant the world. It meant the world. And now it's totally out of my hands, right? This was one of the most jarring things as a writer is you control everything until you send it in, and then you have zero control. And I don't know. It's my fourth book, and I'm still not used to that. Right? Because people are going to find different things in the book, maybe respond to characters in a different way than you thought they would, or maybe even than you intended. But that's the game. That's how storytelling works. And I try to keep myself busy with other things, so I don't drive myself crazy on what I cannot control.
You mentioned earlier that you found the transition between non-fiction to fiction fairly straightforward. It's the way that your brain processes things. I was interested, just if you don't mind telling us a bit about your first publication, Kaboom, which sort of morphed out of a blog that you did that was closed down due to controversy. Could you just tell us something about that, please?
Yes. So my first book was nonfiction, and when I was in Iraq as a young lieutenant, I kept a blog, and it was mostly pretty well received until June 2008. My colonel wanted to promote me, and I wanted to stay on, which would have taken me to kind of a rear position. I thought I was doing the honorable thing and said, "Oh, sir, I'm not planning on making the Army a career. I'd like to stay on the line with my platoon if possible." And he chewed me out. I was kind of being I don't know. I thought I was trying to do the honorable thing. I think maybe he took it personally as a career officer that I told him so openly that was not my intention. And then I went back and blogged about it in my hooch. And portrayed him very unflatteringly. It was a bit of a punk move, but I was young and compared to what our day-to-day life entailed, it was just a small thing. It was just me kind of venting. I did not think it would get back to him. Of course it did. That's in about a couple hours. So, you cannot make fun of your colonel on the internet if any young future military officers are listening. So they shut it down, which, of course had kind of the effect of calling all kinds of more attention to it. Because of the controversy, different publishers and editors got in touch with me, and I said, I still have 9 more months in Iraq. Maybe, can we talk when I get back? Most of whom I never heard back from again, but one house said, yeah, absolutely, would love to hear from you. And so in that way I was kind of fortuitous. Like when I got out of the Army, I had a bit of a plan lined up, and that first book, it's very much an apprentice work. I look back on it as a kind of as a writer now, and have if I could do it now, I would do this, do that. But I was a fiery young kid with big opinions about the crucible we had just been through. So I'll always be proud of it, even if I know it's maybe not my best book from kind of a literary perspective. It was a raw and honest entry into the world of writing, and I'll always be grateful for the people that helped make it happen.
Obviously, you've developed your writing to such a point now where you're actually a writing instructor with Words After War. Could you just tell us a little bit about that project, please?
Sure. That's a community workshop, we call it. It's kind of housed under the New York University English department, but it's open to anybody. And it was again kind of a small, meaningful way. I thought I could kind of give back and bring people from different backgrounds. Usually each class is about half military veteran and half civilian. And we just talk writing. We just talk literature. Sometimes it's war literature. The kind of more vague term we've landed on is conflict literature, because that can entail all kinds of different things. And, just kind of the way that kind of storytelling and good literature, whether fiction or nonfiction, can get people to access an experience of armed conflict or its aftermath. This terrible thing that humanity continues to do to each other and to itself, more often than not for unjust reasons. Occasionally, like in the defense of Ukraine, because it must be done. But what does this all mean? How does this impact not just the participants, but their children, their families back home, their communities? This stuff matters. It's not something that we're sequestered from, even in the West, though it can often feel that way. And it's been tremendously fulfilling, Bob, watching people from very different backgrounds, very different politics in some cases, connect through good writing and good storytelling, and then sharing their own, right? Which is anybody that's ever shared their own work with people, oftentimes strangers. That can be a scary thing, but it's tremendously fulfilling, and we're on hiatus right now, but hoping to get it started again soon. Because I don't know, it's important, and I've seen it impact lives for the better, and that matters.
And this is an online initiative, is it?
It was. So originally we did it in person in New York, and then when COVID hit, we were like, well, let's try it online, which has actually been great, because it's opened it up to people from all over. We've had people join us from England, in fact. God bless them. They're showing up at like 1 a.m. To be able to do it. So in a strange way, the pandemic and forcing us to go online had a real positive effect, at least in this little corner of things.
Yeah, and in terms of your own writing, obviously you're writing magazine articles. I mentioned the Esquire article earlier on, and you're writing books. What's the main? What's your process for writing? First of all, a magazine article, Matt.
Well, I think I have a process now. A lot of this stuff just kind of takes time, and kind of maybe almost realizing after the fact that you're doing things the same way or a similar way. I try to start kind of with everyday people and how a big macro force has changed them, and try to get. I'm not very good at much in this life, to be honest with you. But I think something I am good at is capturing everyday life transformed. I mean, I'm working on a story right now of Afghan refugees who are living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, of all places, right? And a completely different place than they were, and they're making the best of it they can, and showing kind of the good and the bad of that, right? And how, in many cases here in Oklahoma, it's the women who are thriving because they have kind of much more freedom and mobility than they were used to. Children can be hit or miss, but how Oklahoma found the Pashtun translator, I will never know, but they did. And what a fascinating person, translating for these kids at a local elementary school for $30,000 a year. What a hero! What an everyday hero. And then, but also kind of the downside, right? I interviewed a former Afghan special forces officer, right? I mean, he was used to being in command. This is a leader of men, and he's an Uber driver right now. And all this happened because of the American military's withdrawal from Afghanistan, because the Taliban would have killed these people. So I'm still researching this story, but I share it maybe as kind of an example of what I've done with the Ukraine stories, of finding these interesting, intriguing, everyday people, making the best of it as they can, and trying, by describing their life, describing how they live, describing how their life has changed, getting readers from different circumstances to engage with them and to picture, to wonder, what would I have done in that situation? And that's if I'm executing it correctly, I think that's one of the greatest things literature can do for us, is to think about other people's lives and to place ourselves in their shoes.
Yeah, from military commander to Uber driver is quite something, isn't it?
It is. How
has he responded? Has he responded in a fairly sort of positive way?
He has. This particular individual has not. Some of his peers have, but it was a very damning quote. He said, "America's great for Americans," he still, he does not feel American, and he may spend his entire life feeling. Being a refugee is a different thing than being an immigrant. My grandfather was an immigrant from Belfast, but his family chose to come over. Right, so it's just of course these people are going to, many of them, not all, but many of them are going to have a different relationship to America or to Britain, to wherever.
And if there's anybody listening who's sort of interested in that type of life as a journalist, do you record the interviews or do you just write notes down, or how does it?
I do both. I find, of course, the recording is very good for the transcript and to get the language exactly right, and certainly there for the fact checker who is very annoying but a very instrumental part of what we do. The notebook, though, is really good for kind of getting atmosphere, getting the details. Maybe do they have a slight stutter? Do they pause before answering this question? Are they trying to feed me before a meal? Do they, the kind of stuff that a transcript is not going to capture? That's why that's what I handwrite. Is all these kind of like little personality ticks and observations, both on the person I'm interviewing, but maybe also how I'm receiving it. That's the kind of stuff that I hope helps an interview, helps a profile come alive. So it's not just.
That's the more descriptive stuff for notes.
Exactly right.
How do you go about the fact checking?
Oh, tediously. A place like Esquire pays these people to do a job, and they'll kind of send me rounds of different questions. It's up to me to kind of preemptively send them the transcripts, scan in my handwritten notes and send it to them. Sometimes they'll check with sources, and it's a pain in the ass, I won't lie, but they've saved me more than a few times from getting a quote slightly wrong, or maybe a historical detail is slightly off. So I'm very glad for them after an article comes out. In the thick of it, I'll admit they can be. Yes, that's a diplomatic way of putting it. Yes.
Yeah. And if there's any listeners out there who have always fancied writing a novel, and I'm talking real fiction, what advice would you give them?
Great question. Be prepared to fail, and also be prepared to don't be afraid to use your imagination. Right. I mean, one of the I love nonfiction for a lot of reasons, but I'll admit a preference for fiction because it's a blend of experience and imagination. Right. I was able to do things with these characters, take ideas or snippets of conversation from my own life. As a kid from northern Nevada, and the western part of America, and put some ideas into a Ukrainian character's mouth, and it works. These disparate parts of your life, whether you've experienced them or read them or just imagined them one day on a walk or in the shower, that's that's really kind of what elevates fiction, I think, is it making it more true than reality. So be prepared to fail over and over again, but also even if you're writing close to the bone about historical events like I was with Daybreak, bringing a healthy dose of imagination to it is really kind of what elevates it, I think, into a different level of storytelling that hard reality, that hard journalism just doesn't allow for.
And what about your own process? When you write a novel, do you map it all out first? How does it work in that respect?
Each one has been different. So this is my third novel. With Daybreak, I had a very clear beginning and a very clear end. And then it was kind of a matter of getting there. But some things change. Bogdan is a Ukrainian recruiting officer in the book, and a very prominent character, I think. When I first wrote him, he first appears just in chapter 2. That was it. It was just going to be a one-off. I didn't have plans for him returning to the narrative at all. But I found myself admiring him so much. I found himself such a complicated, interesting character that I thought I had to bring him back. And without giving too much away, he plays kind of an instrumental role later on in the book. So it's this weird blend of I don't know. It's almost like Dwight Eisenhower said something like one time to the effect of like, you have to have a plan to be able to break it, to be able to break from it. And I have found novel writing to be very similar in that regard. Like, it's important to have key tenets, maybe tent poles you want to hit. And certainly with this book, I had kind of had the ending in mind to get to, but also allowing yourself the freedom to let the writing kind of go some strange and unforeseen places, and it might be more interesting as a result. Because I don't know, some writers I know and they do what works for them. They have an outline and they adhere to it rigidly. I don't know. I think I personally would get bored with that, and then I'd be worried that boredom would show up in the actual language and the actual writing.
And do you sort of get into the zone while you're writing and something comes, or is it something when you're on a walk or something, or in the shower that you get a new idea? How does it work?
All of the above. I have found I'm not a morning person at all, but especially with 2 young boys, I found if I don't work those 2 hours before they're up and out of bed, I'm probably not working that day. It also helps to kind of attack in the morning because the clutter of the day isn't really in your brain yet, and then you just some days are really productive and you're humming, and then other days it's just a struggle to maybe even get a couple hundred words. But at least by putting yourself in that chair, I was with Daybreak, I was probably working 5-6 days a week. It stays with you. And then the stuff, okay, maybe you struggled that day and didn't get what you wanted. But yeah, later in the shower, because it's still lingering with you, that aha moment finally comes. And, you're only halfway shampooing your hair, but you hop out to write something down in the notebook. I've had that happen a few times. So
you try and sort of go for 2 hours a day first thing, do you? Is that your general?
When I'm in a project, yes. Yeah. Finish a book, I take a break. I feel like I've earned it a little bit. But yeah, when I'm mired in a project, that's 2 to 3 hours a day. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, obviously you brought out Daybreak, and it might be a bit pushy, but have you got anything new in the pipeline? Any new novel ideas?
I do, yeah. I'm still in the research phase of it, but I want to write a book about 1860s Virginia City, Nevada, which is a mining town out west that was a big boom town with silver mines. And my country right now is in a weird place. It's in a dark, strange place. And I personally, as a citizen of this republic, have found some faith in remembering that this is not the first time we've been in a dark place and we felt torn apart and we've been deeply uncertain of our future, both internally and our place in the world. And I think that's kind of where it stems from is what Civil War veterans, both from the North and the South, who came out west to start all over. And it's also, it's about where I grew up. It's about the place that reared me, that raised me. And, kind of like I was just talking about earlier, like, will I be bringing, I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, but will I be bringing some of my memories and experiences of that Northern Nevada to the 1860s, to this novel? Of course. And that's part of the beauty of it. I hope that's the goal. That's the goal, at least.
Yeah. So it's Reno that you were brought up. How near is that to where these silver mines are?
25-minute drive. 25-minute drive. Yeah. So right down the hill.
I read a little bit about Reno. I mean, it looks like it's described as a sort of one of the best little cities in the world, I believe.
Yes, biggest little city in the world. Yep.
It must have been a great place to grow up because you've got theatre and stuff like that, and then you've got snow and mountains and walking and trails. And how you must have found it great, growing up there. I would have thought.
Oh gosh, I miss it as an adult, but growing up, I was an ambitious kid with big dreams. I couldn't wait to get out of there, and it was kind of limiting in some ways. It can't, at least the one it's bigger now than the one I grew up in, but like it had village elements to it for sure. But yeah, it was. I mean, the physical landscape was tremendous, and so I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. But I wouldn't be who I was without it. And but yeah, it's a jarring. When I went to university, I went about as far away as I could get. I went to school in North Carolina, and I remember one of my first college professors was asking who we were, where we were from. She goes, "Reno. That must have been interesting," and it's all I knew. So it was not interesting to me. But that the tone and her statement has stuck with me all these years because it was interesting. I just didn't know it.
No, it seems to have everything you need in it, really.
Yeah, including the casinos. At one point it was the divorce capital of the world. Back in like the 20s or the 30s.
Lots of people would come from around the different states and go there to divorce.
To divorce, yep. And urban legend, even when I was growing up there, that you went sifting through the river, you could still find old diamond rings from where freshly divorced women had tossed them in to celebrate their newfound freedom.
Wow. Well, it's been a great conversation, Matt. Where can people find out more about you and your book? I'm online. My website is mattgallagherwriter.com. You can find out more about Daybreak or just my work in general. I'm also on Twitter or X, Matt Gallagher 0, Instagram at Matt Gallagher 0. And drop me a line, shoot me an email. Always happy to converse with readers about all sorts of things. So I'm easy enough to get a hold of if you want to. Oh, well, that's great, Matt. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I think for listeners and myself, it's really good to hear about what life's really like in Ukraine. And as I say, if you read the book, you get even more of a picture. My guest today has been Matt Gallagher. Matt's book Daybreak is out now, and you will find a link to the book and Matt's website on the show notes. Thanks for coming on the show, Matt.
My pleasure, Bob. Take care.